Before I start this video off, I want to make a quick disclaimer. This video has absolutely nothing to do with politics, economics, or anarchism, but has to do with general philosophy, specifically metaphysics and epistemology. So, if philosophy doesn't happen to be your cup of tea, I highly suggest you do not watch this video and move on. In this video, I shall attempt to provide two arguments detailing why I think the idea of realism is false and/or incoherent. The conclusion I've reached here is not one I'm particularly fond of in any respect. However, I don't see any good way around it. That said, if there's any metaphysical realist out there who has a good argument to show how I'm in error and why I'm in error, then by all means make a video response or a comment to this video. Although, let's try to not get crazy with the comments. Keep in mind that I will not be putting forward any positive argument or proposition for idealism. On the contrary, I will attempt to show why alternatives to idealism, i.e. realism, are seemingly incoherent. For those of you not familiar with modal logic, logical connectives, logical formulas, or logical sentences, I shall try to translate the symbolic propositional form of my argument into everyday language. Although for the sake of clarity, I'm going to have to oversimplify certain parts of my argument when stating the propositional form in everyday English. Otherwise, it's just going to come out really convoluted. Although if you're already familiar with, symbolic logic or modal logic, you should be fine. For clarity's sake, I shall also introduce a few operational definitions for particular terms I'll be using before I get on with my argument. And for those of you who want to pick apart my argument in full detail, see the links in the video description. And the subject of logic, logical connectives, also referred to as logical operators, are conceived of as symbols or words used to string together or connect at least two or more sentences to form valid compound sentences. These compound sentences have truth values which completely depend on the truth values of the original sentence strung together. I'll give you an incomplete list of logical connectives that I'll be using, but this list, although not complete, is sufficient to outline and formalize the argument I'll be making. So we have or exclusive disjunction, such as in the sentence either A or B but not both. We have or as inclusive disjunction, such as either A or B or both. We have your standard conditional, if then, your standard biconditional, if and only if, negation, not, and conjunction and. I shall also be using two modal operators as well. To give you some idea of what this means, quoting Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, modal logic, in a very narrow sense, studies reasoning that involves the use of the expressions necessary and possibly. When modal operators are applied to logical formulas, they denote such formulas as being either necessary or possible. Here are the modal operators: necessarily, or necessary, and possibly. A single caveat: when I make use of the word or symbol necessarily or necessary, I'm saying this only under the assumption that the logical lawful constants in the past will remain true in the present and future. And the last symbol I'll be using is the triple dots, which simply means therefore it follows that, whatever it is. I need to find a few more terms. Performative contradiction. A performative contradiction is a proposition whose semantic content contradicts the presuppositions which make the proposition's truth possible. Some standard examples are all statements must be false, as it would imply to that statement, saying I am not speaking to you right now as I'm speaking to you, or saying I can imagine a mute singer, as the concept of a mute and the concept of a singer, while the presuppositions necessary to conceive of that are violated by the conjunction of those two words. Observer. Observer, in the sense that I'm using, is one who possesses at least one, some, or all of the following perceptive attributes: touch, smell, taste, hearing, sight, balance, body kinesthetic, conscious thought, feeling, and/or intuition. The world, or W, is the set of all existence. Now let's get on to mind-dependent world. A mind-dependent world is a world whose existence completely depends on at least one, some, or all forms of perception, and also subsequently an observer who does the perceiving. If perception is not occurring, then the world ceases to be. Put another way, to be is to be perceived. Esse est percipi, to quote Berkeley. The other definition we want is a mind-independent world, or realism, which is a world whose existence is completely independent or is no way dependent on at least one, some, or all forms of perception. If a mind-independent world is the case, then there is some degree of connection or overlap between it and the mind-dependent world. Okay. The basic proposition here, and this is a bit oversimplified for any of you who understand the propositional form of my argument, is either idealism is necessarily true or realism is necessarily true. Realism isn't true, therefore idealism is necessarily true. And the justification here for this second premise is as follows. This is the argument. Premise 1. Only true propositions are coherent. Premise 2. All incoherent propositions are false, but not all false propositions are necessarily incoherent. Premise 3. Imaginability, logical consistency, and understandability are necessary and sufficient conditions for the coherence of a proposition. Premise 4. If a proposition is not imaginable, logically consistent, or understandable, then it is not coherent. From 3. Premise 5. It is impossible to imagine a mind-independent world without contradiction, because imagination is a form of perception. The act of perception is therefore necessary to conceive or picture a mind-independent world, which thus violates the presuppositions that a mind-independent world is founded upon. In other words, one cannot imagine an observerless world, as imagination is a form of observation, and one cannot remove oneself from one's own thoughts. A mind-independent world is a performative contradiction. The proposition that a mind-independent world is true is not coherent, from 4 and 5, and premise 7 is therefore it follows that, or the conclusion is, therefore it follows that a mind-independent world is false, from 2. I have one other argument which I'll make by invoking the principle of parsimony. And the principle of parsimony basically states that when you have two completing theories that explain a phenomenon equally well, the one that makes the least or smallest number of assumptions is more likely to be true, because the more assumptions you have, the more likely that one of those assumptions is wrong. And this is basically my argument as follows. Realism, whether naive or indirect, as a purely positive proposition, tries to explain reality by assuming that both a mind-dependent world and a mind-independent world exist. It also assumes that there is some degree of connection or overlap between the mind-independent world and the mind-dependent world. Idealism, as a purely positive proposition, tries to explain reality by assuming only that a mind-dependent world exists. Idealism makes two fewer assumptions than realism does. Therefore, per the principle of parsimony, idealism is more likely to be true, because the likelihood that one of its assumptions is false is comparatively less than that of realism, as idealism makes two fewer assumptions than realism does. This would also mean that realism would be more likely to be false. Okay, that's my argument. It doesn't really sound very pretty, and there's actually some more implications of this argument that I may get to in future videos. But yes, if you have any counter arguments to these videos, or any comments, feel free, or any video responses you want to make, feel free to do so. And goodbye.